Tokamate. Oops. Thank you everybody for joining us today to the Protect the Sacred Through Coastal Connections webinar. Before we get started, I'd just like to let everybody know that this is being recorded so that we can have it and share it with others afterward. So just so everybody's aware. Thank you to Abuela Malinali, to the artist that sang that song. She is a moon dancer who is from Michoacan, Mexico, and she has been a guardian and a leader of the Olin Tlawi Meshli Moon Dance Circle in Mexico. She's also a sun dancer and a healer. And so to be able to share one of her songs today is an honor. We give thanks for her and for all the work she does for the earth and for women and for people in general, trying to build connections within ourselves, within each other, within the earth. And I thought that that song was very appropriate to share as it talks about having a time that is to return, the melody that our ancestors once sang, to have us be free as birds and sing that melody again. That's going to resonate throughout this webinar, that we are going to be sharing what our ancestors always knew, that we need to protect the earth so we can protect ourselves, so she can protect us. And so thank you again. And I'm going to open up with another song before we give introductions. This one is called We Tonantzin. It is the Nahuatl language, one of the indigenous languages of Mexico. Prior to 1848, before the US and Mexico border was created, our people readily and always migrated through from the southern regions of the Americas to the northern regions and back every year. It's a natural occurrence. And so I'm glad and humbled to share this song and this prayer with you all in honor of our venerable Mother Earth. We tonantzin, tonantzin, we tonantzin, tonantzin, we tonantzin, tonantzin, we tonantzin, tonantzin, ipalnemo wani no yolotatsin, tatsu kamati tonantzin. My name is Melissa Mish Sochi Zamora. I'm from so-called Corpus Christi, Texas. I'd like to give a land acknowledgement that we are on Karankoan land, predominantly throughout the areas that we are going to be discussing today, from Houston down to Galveston and Corpus Christi. It was predominantly Karankoan people that preoccupied and still are here today. So shout out to our Karankoan brothers and sisters and ancestors, as well as other tribal people like the Comanche, the Coahuiltecan, and of the Mexica, which I'm a part of, and the Lipan Apache. So I'm a part of the Indigenous People of the Coastal Bend. So we are an intertribal organization that is made up of some of the tribes I just mentioned. We're open to any and all other tribes of the Coastal Bend. We're just kind of like we're finding each other again and remembering some of the old ways and trying to organize in the ways that we can. And so with the intention set today to have a good presentation for you all, to be able to have the folks that need to hear it here today, and to be able to have our voices lifted and shared far and wide to echo and create a new narrative for the future, for future generations. So I'd like to pass it on to Rebecca, and then if y'all want to just pass it on to each other so we can introduce ourselves.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you for that introduction. That was beautiful. My name is Rebecca Staub, and I am the Communications Manager for Turtle Island Restoration Network. We are a global ocean conservation nonprofit, and we have many offices around the country, and one of them is in Galveston, Texas. Our headquarters are located in Northern California, and that office is on land of the Coast Miwok and Grayton Rancheria. And I am currently working out of Denver, Colorado, and I am on Arapaho land. And with that, I will pass it to Joni.
Thank you, Rebecca. Good evening, everyone. I'm so honored to be here with Fenceline Watch and the Indigenous people of the Coastal Bend, and we appreciate you participating in this webinar. Rebecca introduced the organization. I am the program director for Turtle Island Restoration Network, and as she stated, I'm in the occupied Karankawa land, also known as Galveston, and I will pass it on to my other colleague, Kimber.
Joni and Melissa, thank you for such a beautiful prayer song to open us up with. My name is Kimber De Salvo Anderson. I am Turtle Island Restoration Network's Gulf Program Coordinator. And as Joni mentioned, our office is located on Karankawa land in Galveston, Texas. And I'm honored to be talking with you all today. Thank you. And I will pass it on to Love Sanchez.
Hello, my name is Love Sanchez. I am a founding member of the Indigenous People of the Coastal Bend. I am also a descendant of the Karankawa people. And our group is located in Corpus Christi, Texas, which was predominantly occupied by Karankawa people, but we also had Lipanabachi, Carisoca, Macrudo, Comanche, and Mexica and Conateca.
And good afternoon. My name is Yvette Arellano. I am currently speaking to you from the occupied territories of the Karankawa, Sana, Atacapa Ishak, and so many others. And Fenceline Watch is an organization based out of Houston, Texas, an environmental justice organization dedicated to the eradication of toxic multi-generational harm on communities living on the fence line of industry, whether oil, gas, or other extractive process. So thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and I'd just like to wrap up that we're all working together because we're all along the Gulf of Mexico, as well as having similar goals when it comes to stopping oil exploitation and saving, preserving as much natural waters and air and land and people as we can. I don't know if Love, you want to share about how this partnership began before we get started.
Yes, I just like to say, I like to say that I'm grateful for us all meeting each other. And I met Kimber through a meeting, and she was speaking about the Karankawa people and acknowledged us, and we joined together to bring this webinar together for y'all. So I'm very appreciative of meeting everyone, and I am very happy that I feel we're going to have a great webinar today. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, ladies. We will begin then. I appreciate it. So Turtle Island is an ocean conservation organization, as Rebecca stated, and we work hard for broad protection of the ocean, marine wildlife, and the watershed that sustains it. Next, please. We have projects in Costa Rica and the Galapagos Island. We work to protect the migratory swimway of sharks and sea turtles, and we work with communities and local governments for far-reaching protection of marine wildlife. Next, please. Scientists estimate that 25% of all marine species live on coral reefs, making them one of the most diverse habitat in the world. Next, please. In the Gulf of Mexico, we have 5 of the 7 species of sea turtles, and starting in the top left-hand corner, there's the hawksbill going clockwise, loggerhead, top right, bottom right is the green sea turtle, the bottom left is the leatherback, and the center is the Kemp's Ridley. 3 of these species, the Kemp's Ridley, the loggerhead, and green, do nest on our Texas beaches. And on the eastern portion of the Gulf, we'll see nests from loggerheads, greens, and leatherbacks. Next slide, please. The Kemp's Ridley is our Texas state sea turtle, and it does nest on our beaches in Texas. It primarily nests on the beaches in Mexico, and we are considered the northernmost edge of their nesting area. And on this image, you are looking at Galveston Island, and that is the far east end of the island. This is a species in the mid-80s that was on the verge of extinction. And about 1985 to 1987, there were only about 350 nesting females documented for the entire nesting season. Next slide, please. Sea turtles' life cycle will include time in the water and on land, and all stages of their life cycle can be impacted by an oil spill. On the beaches, we see nesting females and hatchlings that can be covered in oil. The nest can be inundated with oil in the nest cavity. As adults and juveniles are swimming in the open ocean, they may inhale vapors, they can ingest the oil by eating their prey, and they can become covered in the oil. Prey species are also depleted when we see oil spills, and numerous species will die from exposure, ingestion, and inhalation from a spill. Next slide, please. As the largest offshore oil spill in US history, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill released 134 million gallons of oil into the Gulf of Mexico over 87 days, polluting 1,300 miles of shorelines along the 5 Gulf states. Only about 25% of the oil was recovered, leaving gallons of oil on the seabed. Sea turtles are a long-lived species, and it will take decades for scientists to truly understand the toll that oil spill takes on them. Next slide, please. The oil spill contaminated prime marine mammal habitat to the near shore and offshore waters in the northern portion of the Gulf of Mexico. The Deepwater oil spill contaminated every habitat that marine mammals occupy. Marine mammals have been exposed to oil by inhalation, aspiration, ingestion, including sediment, water, and prey, and by absorbing the contaminants through their skin. Next slide, please. The oil exposure to the dolphins led to reproductive failure and additional illnesses. Our coastal population plummeted, calves continue to have low birth rates, and dolphin populations are still experiencing skin lesions. Exposure to chemicals in the oil weakened their immune system, making it harder for them to fight off disease and parasite. Oil contaminated their food supply, making prey sick or making them die, and there was less prey and poor quality of prey. Dolphins living in the oiled area in the Gulf were 4 times more likely to die from infection than dolphins that were stranding elsewhere. Their adrenaline glands were also impacted, and they are important to dolphins because it helps them to respond to stress and control their blood pressure. Next slide, please. Nearly 1 million birds died from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Oil damaged their plumage, and they can potentially ingest it when they're preening. It reduces their ability to regulate their temperatures and their insulation, making them susceptible to hypothermia. The rate of the heat loss for bird species is higher in water than it is in the air. So the oil plumage is very problematic for birds that feed when they are diving. Oil silk birds are unable to fly and stay afloat because their insulation and their waterproofing of their feathers is damaged. They are likely to have reduced survival rates because of the difficulties they have obtaining food and escaping from predators. It is imperative that we protect the Gulf's endangered species and the fragile environments in these critical habitats from oil exploration and invasive massive spills. The Gulf of Mexico's beautiful and valuable ecosystem and animals are deserving of critical protection. Thank you.
Ha'a e awa na ya na ta e ga Sanchez. Hello, how are you? My name is Lev Sanchez. That was Karankawa language that you just heard. Next slide, please. On this slide, you will see a map. The Karankawa people lived along the coast from Galveston to Corpus Christi, Texas. The reason why we're presenting some of this to y'all is because Galveston to Corpus Christi was predominantly Karankawa territory. So I'll go ahead and go on. The Karankawa people lived, oh, I'm sorry, please go back. The Karankawa people lived along the coast. As you can see on the map, there was 5 clans that lived along the 5 rivers. Next, please. The Karankawa people of Houston and Galveston were called the Cocos. Other tribes that lived in the area were Caddo, Ishka, Gosha, and Mexica. The reason why I mention all the people who lived in this area is because the resources were shared amongst them. The Karankawa people were predominantly in the area and knew the area very well. They shared the info with others who visited or stayed to live. Next slide, please. Now, the people in the Corpus Christi area were also Karankawa and were predominantly in this area as well. Our ancestors were called the Copanes here, I'm sorry. Some maps that I researched have other names, and I noticed that in one particular map, they were also called the Orejones, which was in Spanish for big ears. To note, I just want to note this really quick, our people were tall and they were heavily tattooed and pierced. Some research says that this was due to mating. So it was almost like they were peacocking each other with their piercing and their tattoos. Another thing to note is that pre-colonization, it showed that our ancestors' remains had no trauma. So this myth that we were savages, that our ancestors were savages, is false. There was no trauma to the bones prior to colonization. However, after colonization, the remains of our ancestors did have trauma because of the fact that they were fighting amongst all the wars that were happening around them and people trying to take their land and colonizers coming into the bays. Further note, another myth is that we were cannibals. However, our diet consisted of what was around us. And since we lived near the water, it was seafood that was most consumed. And of course, they hunted deer and other animals when they would go inland a little bit. Alongside us lived Lipanapachi, Mexica, Colantecan, Carizoca, Macrudo, and Comanche tribes. As mentioned before, my ancestors knew the land very well and did not hesitate to teach people that visited or decided to live in the area. Next slide, please. Now, many say that we do not exist anymore. That is not true. Though I am not full-blooded, I recognize through oral history of my family and the stories and the deep connection that I have to the land and water, and we know who we are. That is not enough to the people who destroy the things that are sacred to us, I feel. I sometimes think that they don't care when they destroy our land and water, but I know that they are afraid, and for us to find out who we are, and we don't need anyone or anybody to tell us who we are because we know exactly who we are. It's these processes that we have to go through with these entities that are destroying our land and water that is just very upsetting. It's for us to protect our land and water, it's starting to become a problem. Now, a little bit about our organization. Here's some dates. In 2016, some of us met while we were protesting against water contamination from the industry that resulted in 18 months of off and on water boils. In 2018, our Indigenous Circle received a proclamation that states Indigenous Tribes of the Coastal Bend. It was proclaimed. We then utilized that name and created a small grassroots group. In 2019, we petitioned the city to change Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, and now every second Monday of October is proclaimed as such. 2020 to now, we have a strong collective of Indigenous people in our area with allies, and I'm proud of how much we have done in such little time, even with the pandemic going on. What's amazing is the fact that our Indigenous Circle consists of the same exact Indigenous people that once all lived here together. Our ancestors all lived in this area, and now we all work together. Next slide, please. Now, working together to protect the land and water has become something special to us. One might ask, what is the relationship to this area for us? Now, if you look at the map, these areas were huge fishing grounds and hunting grounds for our ancestors. These areas were important to the Indigenous people who lived in the area. They relied on the resources that came from the water and the land. These areas are still vital and sacred to the people. Fishing is very dominant still in this area, and people depend on the area, especially the marine life that still live there. Obviously, they depend on the water and land that's being destroyed. So that's the connection that we have to the land and water. Next slide, please. I'd like to conclude by saying that our ancestors knew the land and water very well. We as a collective are trying to protect it as best as we know how. The fossil fuel industry has been getting away with things far too long. I have no fear as I move forward in what we do, and I'm very proud of everything we have done. We are the people that cannot wait no more. That is why we keep standing up and trying to make changes. We want to see this world become beautiful and healthy as it used to be. Our world is dying, our waters are dirty, our land is being destroyed, and if this continues, we will all be gone one day. We must revive these traditions, and we got to remember who we are so we could start protecting the land and water. I ask all the allies and friends to join us when we do things. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Joni and Love. Man, it's an honor to talk with you all. Again, my name is Melissa. I've already introduced myself, so I'm not going to go into it again. Oh, next slide, please. I'm sorry, I was about to try to get my own slide. Okay, so yeah, growing up in Corpus Christi, you know, it's a really beautiful place. It's next to the water. I love all of the different birds that we get to see, the animals, these dolphins, of course, but the turtles, some of these things that I didn't even see until I got older. Some kids that live here don't even, haven't even been to the beach before. There is a little bit of a disconnect with certain neighborhoods, and I would say there is a really awesome, amazing part of the city that I love, and there's also a really ugly side that I can see and have been seeing needs improvements. And so that would be, you know, ever since many, many years ago, whenever the city was founded, they came across oil. But there was a predominantly Black neighborhood on the north side of Corpus Christi where a lot of these refineries have been built. So a lot of the fenceline communities are impacted severely, and it's mainly people of color, Indigenous, Black, and people of color, low-income communities that have to brent the harsh realities of living next to industry, which we'll get into further. Next slide, please. And so here's a map of the Corpus area and the Gulf of Mexico. This was created by the Coastal Alliance to Protect Our Environment. It's a local alliance here made up of several organizations. They made this really telling graphic. And so if you look at all of these different colored squares, these are new or planned facilities going from anywhere from tank farms to polymer production plants, steel plants, Exxon Sabic, one of the world's largest plastic pellet producing plants in Portland, Cheniere, which is LNG. We have very large crude carriers, so oil export terminals, many different terminals, and they're just trying to occupy as much land as they can around this area. And they need water to supply and make all of those different products, whether it be diesel, jet fuel, gasoline, plastic products, all of these different chemicals. They need a lot of water to create those and to go through their systems so that they don't explode from the heat being so great. They need water to cool their towers down. So it's a lot of, they want a lot of water to do that, and they're proposing to have desalination plants strategically placed throughout the industrial area. Yet they're telling the residents that it's for us when we know that that's not true. But there is a false narrative that is very active in the city right now that we're trying to combat with webinars like this. So thank you for the platform. There's also a lot of dredging going on, and they're trying to deepen the channel so that they can bring even bigger ships and tankers so that they can export even more oil that's coming from like the Eagle Ford Shale and the Permian Basin, and all different pipelines to get exported out of here. Next slide. So yeah, the Port of Corpus Christi has a lot to do with that. They lease a lot of the land to these industries, and so they're the landlords. Here are some figures from last year that I got from their website. So they're going from January to September, staying at a steady average between 1.3 to 1.7 million barrels of oil per day that's exporting out. So if you can imagine one barrel times that to 1.3 million per day, that is an extraordinarily large amount. That is contributing to large amounts of fossil fuel burning that can contribute or is contributing to the climate crisis. So we are part of such a bigger picture here that it gets overwhelming sometimes, but the more we know, the more we can do to challenge this. So we're still trying to understand everything going on. And while private industries are gaining millions of dollars every day, residents and the environment are getting stuck with all of the pollution, and we're not going to stand for it. Next slide. And like I said, so local industrial operations are contributing to the global climate crisis. So growing up here, I knew it was bad, but I didn't realize that it was this bad until I learned more about environmental science and the global energy exchange and how this industry functions and all of the different implications. But here's a timeline of what we've been dealing with. Of 2020 was just a hell of a year just because of the pandemic. But on top of that, in August of 2020, the Corpus Christi ship channel had an explosion. Orion dredging vessel was going through trying to dredge. They struck a underwater propane pipeline that caused an explosion, and 4 people were killed, and those were workers, and 6 others were hospitalized. So the workers that were on that vessel actually are turning around and trying to sue the company for putting them in this kind of predicament. In September of 2020, 2 miles offshore near Bob Hall Pier. So this is in Port Aransas across our causeway over to the Gulf of Mexico. And this was a Magellan-owned LNG condensate platform that burst. It was a very loud rupture. Neighbors came out and said that they smelled a strong smell of gas. And this was going on for several hours, I think maybe even a couple of days before it was contained. And so if you can imagine, just being around these types of things and happening frequently is very concerning and scary, and anxiety is going up. And so among everything else, but in December of 2020, another Corpus Christi ship channel explosion happened again at the Magellan factory this time. So or this was at a storage tank, and they were trying to clean the tank, and something happened out of all of these different ones. And there's links provided here. There wasn't clear information on how it started. They're very private about when things like this happen, and they don't want people to know the cause or any other information. So there's just a lot, and this is just a piece of what happens here regularly and throughout the years that this industry has been existent. So, or has been in existence. Go next slide. So Moda Midstream is in a current oil export terminal. This one is located on the Ingleside area. And so here to the left, you can see an aerial photo. This is Moda's operation over here, all of these tanks. And there is where the dock or their vessels come over and fill up on oil to be exported. Over here to the left of them is Ingleside on the bay. This is where a lot of people live. They're very concerned about all of this traffic of the large vessels, a lot of the air pollution, noise pollution. They recently hit their own pier with one of the vessels and busted the pier, creating a loud sound and different ruptures happening. So it's all very scary for residents, and they're trying to encroach even closer to this residential area. And so this circled piece here is where Moda is actively trying to submit permits to create more space for their exporting operations. And this is where the Karankawa people come in, and where I want to give the floor to Love to kind of share a little background context on this area and why this is so important to us to protect.
Thank you, Melissa. So just to be really brief on this section, so if you look at this circle area where it's yellow, this is called the Glowing Bluff. So research states that artifacts were found in this area. Now they did their excavation and found just a portion. They kind of just digged up just a portion and said, okay, here's some artifacts, and didn't bother looking at the other areas of what they have leased out, because they don't own the land. As Melissa mentioned, Port is their landlord. So as they are expanding, we are definite that they're going to be probably digging up more artifacts, and we're trying to protect this area. Also, about maybe 3 miles away from this facility, Karankawa remains were found. So there's no doubt in our mind that there's going to be uplifting of others' remains or artifacts. And that's very disturbing to even think about, because they're not stopping from expanding. And if you look at the marker, this is an overlay on the right side. These are where all the industrial sites are on. And then you see the map that I showed earlier, where there was findings of artifacts, and the fact that these hunting sites and fishing sites are in the same vicinity of where all these industrial are now. And it's just really sad to look at. But we are in the process of trying to protect this area and bring awareness to the area. So we hope that, the public can support us when we start sharing more data on this, because it's still moving along. Thank you, Melissa.
Yes, thank you, Love. As she mentioned, we're trying through all different avenues, whether that be through submitting public comment or getting the word out through the media, or having prayer actions at the site, or getting in touch with different organizations who want to help us, contact the EPA, and all of these different avenues. So I'm learning a lot as we go along, and all of this is definitely a learning experience. Next slide. And so to keep on going with the environmental issues in Corpus, it's not just one element, it's all different elements, these sacred elements, water, soil, and air. These are the elements that sustain us as human beings. We need to be caretakers of these sacred resources before it's too late. And so our city needs to really jump on board with that. I know they're trying here and there, but we need to be more stringent. And our city was recently sued, Corpus Christi was sued by the EPA for violating the Clean Water Act. because there were hundreds of infrastructure pipes, of sewage pipes that were leaking raw sewage into Corpus Christi Bay and other water bodies. And so our infrastructure needs major improvements. We need to come up with stringent conservation strategies before we start trying to bring up desalination. They're trying to jump on the fact that desalination, maybe it can be easier or they don't have to go through. I don't really, the industry is pushing them, and desalination could be a whole nother webinar in itself, but this is just something that doesn't sit well with a lot of residents, the issues with desalination, whether that be through the brine that is proposed to be dumped back into the bay that they're trying to retrieve the water from, which is kind of counterproductive. All of the energy consumption that desalination plants need to keep running is not sustainable after all the energy impacts that we had, even with the recent freeze. We can't have any other type of large industry sucking up all of the energy or the water and then contaminating the air through supporting local oil and gas industries. So lots of issues with water contamination. With soil contamination, we have Superfund sites. There's industrial pollutants like mercury and lead, arsenic in different concentrated areas surrounding the city, whether that be from old landfills or old industries that have been shut down. And then there's really a lack of research in soil studies in general. They do free soil test kits, but they don't test for contaminants like the ones I just mentioned, which should be as people want to try to grow food but are nervous about what's in their soil. Air contamination, of course, with all of these refineries, we have carbon monoxide going into the atmosphere, nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, all of these, and VOCs like benzene, when they get into our lungs and bloodstream, they can cause serious health impacts. And so it not only affects us, our health, but the environment as well. And so we really need to take these things seriously and not think that we can dominate our earth, but that we need to live and coincide in harmony with her. We already are facing impacts of climate change here. We've seen sea level rising. We've had tremendous hurricanes like Hurricane Harvey on the right there, and then extreme weather events. So we just need to stop contributing to the problem. Next slide. A little more statistics here. 90% equals the proportion of children diagnosed with respiratory illnesses living within 0 to 5 miles from Refinery Row. So there have been several studies. This one was done by Driscoll Children's Hospital in 2008, but there was another one done through the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry that came out in 2017, which lists some of these chemicals or compounds that I just mentioned and the health impacts there. I'm not going to go too much into this because I feel like I might be going over time, but I'm sharing links here and information so that y'all can go watch the recording and check this stuff out. Next slide. So not only do we have environmental issues, we have social and economic issues. So social being, those fence line communities that I mentioned before. We have environmental racism in our city, especially along Refinery Row. A lot of residents, again, are low income, people of color. They're living with constant anxiety and fear, frequent explosions, ruptures of gas lines. They feel like their voices aren't being heard, that the city doesn't do enough for their neighborhoods to keep up with maintenance, especially in different areas, whether that be through their parks or their streets. And they're seen as, but they do not identify with living in an industrial district. So they see it as the neighborhood was there first, which they're completely correct. And that the industry came in and devastated that area. And so it's really sad to see, but we're trying to uplift their voices and share their concerns through webinars like this. Last on this slide, lack of diversity in local economy. So we need more green jobs. We need to invest more in the community and less on this industry that's for private interests for their pockets. And we don't see that, even though they try to say, anyway, that's a whole nother issue. There's too much of a focus on this extractive economy with raw resources being taken versus working on environmental and social well-being, creating tourism jobs, conservation and preservation projects, all these different things that we can do, even growing hemp to create biodiesel or bioplastics or something that's biodegradable and not so detrimental to the environment. We need a just transition, period. Next slide. And so the importance of the ecosystem services to touch on, you know, we put a lot of value into these oil industries that we say bring jobs and everything, but we really don't put too much of a value and emphasis on what the ecosystem provides us. And if we did, maybe they would listen a little harder. I don't see why it's not evident that, you know, things like seagrasses, and maybe it's just a lack of education, but I'm glad that y'all are here today. Seagrasses are such a vital part of this ecosystem here. They provide habitat and food for the flounder, for speckled trout, blue crab, sea turtles, and shrimp. They act as carbon sinks, so taking carbon out of the water and putting it back into their bodies or in the sediments. They filter the water, they provide oxygen. And wetlands, you know, they're disappearing at an alarming rate. And these are what help us reduce erosion. They help us with blunting the forces of hurricanes. They help us with flooding. They provide food and habitat for local species that then feed us. So we're all interconnected with the wildlife here, the oysters, the fish populations, the crab, especially with the migratory birds that also depend on them, like the whooping crane and the blue heron. So in general, ecosystem services are really overlooked and taken for granted, and we need to remember everything that these services provide us, even though there's no price. It's invaluable. Next slide. But people are stepping up continuously. We're rising up. The Indigenous people are rising up and defending the earth that, you know, defends or provides for us. And despite the challenges that keep coming, we're continuing to rise up and organize together through the proclamations, through the protests, through actions, and through petitions. Like this one here, that all of these 4,000 plus signatures on trying to get people to vote on the subject of desalination, where the city council just wasn't listening and still isn't listening to the people when we're saying, demanding, let us vote on something like this, instead of just telling us this is what's going to happen. We need more, we need to be heard, and we need to have our voices be taken seriously, because we know the implications that can come with this. Next slide. And so with all the doom gloom, these things that, you know, get to me every day, it's really hard sometimes with this kind of work, with the challenges that we're faced with. But organizations here, like For the Greater Good, we collaborate a lot with the Indigenous people. We're overlapping a lot of our members. We're having a seed and plant swap this Sunday. So we adopted a local park. We're trying to reclaim spaces, green spaces in our city, to try to have and hold a space for not only growing food, growing shade, native shade trees, but having a place to have ceremony, having a place to meet and gather and organize and share information and ideas. And so we hope that if you're from our area, if you want to stop by on Sunday, or if you want to check it out virtually, we're going to be having, I think we're going to share some stuff on our Facebook page. So I'll share more about that. And I'm sorry if I went too long. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And this is my last slide.
Thank you so much for that, Melissa. And thank you, Love, and Joni, and Kimber. My name's Yvette Arellano. Once again, I'm based out of Houston, Texas. And I'm I'm the director and founder of an environmental justice organization that you see on the screen. So I'm just going to go through just a couple of information that people take for granted as being basic. And one of them, I apologize for that. One of them is, first, explaining environmental justice and the fact that environmental justice is the fair and meaningful treatment of people regardless of race, color, origin, or income with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Next slide. So how does this manifest? How do we get environmental justice out of environmental injustice? Well, first we have to really understand and wrap our heads around what it means to have inequality in our society. So everything from the outcomes of a very historical trial that ended today regarding race, to bringing in other factors, specifically income inequality. So how does that manifest? It manifests in the proximity to traffic, industry, hazardous waste sites, landfills that then cause increased health risks. And you've heard this time and time again from previous speakers. But then you see and you hear the stories that Melissa brings forward about how income influences political power and access to decision makers who can address our concerns. And in turn, we have, this constant bout about when and where do we get access to healthcare, nutritional food, and how do we decrease these health risks? So the image in front of you is the beginning of our state's industry or path into a very destructive and now, climactic sort of event. And so both of these are two images. The top one is Baytown, Texas, and the bottom one is Corsicana, Texas. And so we're looking at these images from the early 1900s. So 1901, 1902, thinking of black gold and the images of oil spewing into the air. Well, just because we had this development underway didn't mean that it was completely separate from the people who were living on the land at the time. And in fact, we saw this romanticization, right, of how Corsicana in this postcard has industry and people living next to each other in this very welcoming scene. When in fact, we look now back on history and we look at historical events just like the BP oil spill, and we often forget how often large chemical or oil spills and releases really impact communities that are vulnerable and harmful, from everything like cleaning oil spills, hiring contract workers for temporary cleanup jobs, and the dirty and dangerous work of actually working inside of these plants, 14-hour on shifts, 2 weeks on, 1 week off. So I'm going to share with you a story that came out of the BP oil spill as we sit here today in commemoration of that horrible day. When 700 people from the African-American community of Bendel, Mississippi were hired on for a beach cleanup, and that beach cleanup was the 2010 BP Deepwater Horizon disaster response. Contract workers received absolutely no health screenings for pre-existing conditions. They only received 4 hours of training instead of the 40 hours required for hazardous waste cleanups. Contract workers weren't well informed about oil chemical hazards or symptoms of exposure. They weren't given respirators. And so even the basic act of using a respirator would be an act of termination. So when contractors became sick, they were diagnosed with heat stress. For dizziness, they were also diagnosed with food poisoning or nausea and bacterial infections. And what we learned from these events is that industry turned back around to once again say, okay, it could have been contact with things like hazardous chemicals from the BP oil spill. And this continued and research accumulated to now what is known as the BP syndrome, for non-specific cold and flu-like symptoms that then cleanup workers had to face. These contract workers were returned home after the jobs were completely finished to once again spread that disease amongst families who also became sick, doing basic things like washing your clothes with your children's clothes, exposing and sharing the contaminants and toxics with each other unknowingly. So this is simply one piece of history that we often forget when we're talking about the BP oil spill, that we have to have a more holistic image of what actually is going on. So it is the contamination of the water, it is the deaths of multiple species, but it's also the harm on vulnerable communities, not only doing the dirty jobs that nobody wants to do, but also living in communities that have become neglected because they're seen as less influential or having less resources. Next slide. So how does environmental justice and addressing environmental racism, how does that affect us on a global scale? Well, one, I want to reassure you that it does, that this consistent message of environmental justice has global ramifications from everything like the first People of Color Conference in 1991, when grassroots organizations gathered together to say no more. We will no longer be undercutting vulnerable communities. We will no longer be settling in court with major industries after they have had catastrophic events happen inside of low-resourced communities of color, migrant communities, and everyone else at everyone's expense. At the global scale, we started seeing documents being produced like the 1992 Rio de Janeiro agreements that once again gave us validation in our efforts from indigenous communities to communities, other communities of color, saying, hey, we need to get back to protecting Mother Earth. We need to protect our species. We need to protect our water, which is why I was more than happy to join this panel, seeing all of us converge on these issues. Next slide. And with that, I'm going to bring in a piece of intersection into this conversation, specifically around language. Throughout the entire presentation, you've heard about the importance of the public input process. And yet again, one of our vulnerable communities are migrant communities that are seated next to every other community, from Thai fisherfolk communities to Mexican American or other migrant communities, coming and basically situating in communities that are vulnerable and sit next to industry and cannot participate because of historical barriers that at one point, the tables were completely turned. I really want to thank this amazing attorney who taught me this piece of history, Isabel Segarra, who is now with the Harris County Attorney's Office, who literally taught me that, hey, the beginning of Texas and translation started with Stephen F. Austin claiming out to the Mexican government, the settlers, the colonizers who had taken home here on these territories had said time and time again, basically, we can't live here if we don't understand, or if they can't live here if they don't understand basic laws of governance. So currently, we're in the same conversation, simply saying we cannot continue taking the atrocities on our land confronted by industry like oil, gas, and the petrochemical industry without having a say. But this conversation started in our Texas history with Spanish to English translation. Next slide. Why is this important? Well, one, there was a massive movement called the Civil Rights Movement that gave us all access and a right to an equitable process, especially through federal means. And so when Melissa talks about, public hearings and public meetings and getting involved, or when Love does, it's so important for us to remember that we have individual power and strength in numbers the more we become involved in the permitting process from early stages, similar to the desalinization fights that are going on in Corpus Christi. Because the Civil Rights Act, it has a clause in it, Title VI, that completely protects us, and it basically protects us from discrimination, in this case, language discrimination. So the public input process is there for everyday people to become aware of what's going on in our communities and have an opportunity and have a say into the kinds of activities like oil and gas that are going to affect our health and the many generations to come after us. with this, I want to say that we are currently in this process, and today had one of 2 hearings in our state to say that these language barriers must be addressed. We need more people involved in the process, and I encourage folks to show up to the next hearing that's going to be on Thursday at 1:30 in the afternoon. Again, the more people, the more inclusive the process we create, the more momentum we have. Next slide. And the reason why this is important is because, again, going back to vulnerable communities being highly affected, what does an issue like language do to a community? Well, one, it creates this feeling that we do not belong in the communities where we're situated when we have historical ties, like you just saw and you just heard, to these lands. 2, it creates an intimidation when even arriving to these meetings and only receiving resources in one single language, or having an oil and gas representative speak the language that is English, and here is someone who speaks a different language, not able to understand the potential impacts to not only their health and their family's health, but to the health of their future. So with this, this is the Institute of Cervantes from Harvard University that highlighted these very specific details, saying that Hispanics are less likely than other racial minorities to have things like health insurance, or that we have 10.2 million Hispanics that live without health insurance, especially when we're sitting in this moment during a global pandemic. These issues hit us close to home because we know that if our communities are situated next to industries that pollute toxic contaminants, PM 2.5, VOCs like cancer-causing benzene, it's going to create more susceptibility in our communities to COVID-19. And then the last fact here is that, you know, not only is age and proximity and language a barrier, but so is status. And so in the table you see over to the right, you see how someone with migratory status or with citizenship status versus someone who is US born is disproportionately affected. So these issues and these intersections continue to be created, which is why it's even more important that we not forget and not neglect folks who are most vulnerable. And with that, I'd say that we have an issue in our entire advocacy where we tend to forget homeless populations that are unhoused and not only exposed during a certain amount of work time or outside time, but 24/7. Next slide. So when we look at issues like GulfLink, these issues become segmented, and we have agencies like MIRAD or the TCQ separating these very connected systems. So just like the human system and the ecosystem is all one system, so is the oil and gas industry. And yet in these permit applications, we see how there is an air permit for land above ground storage facilities, to offshore platforms, to very large crude carriers, such as with GulfLink. Why is it detrimental that these issues are presented to us in a segmented way? Well, this slide creates that story and creates that picture. Harris County facilities reported over 16,000 tons of VOCs in 2018, but GulfLink alone would emit more than 9,000 tons, and yet these issues sit very separated. So you would have emissions come from offshore, from the platforms, and then from storage facilities that then would again impact Gulf Coast communities, including people of color communities, low resource communities, and mixed status communities. Next slide. And I bring us to this point that is, we are a culture. The Gulf Coast is a culture. We grow up eating crawfish and blue crab and catfish. I'm sure each one of us can remember having a trip to the ocean, having an Uncle Fish along the waters, or having the stories just shared by Texas and Louisiana, folks in Mississippi and Florida, of eating our very culturally rich foods and sharing them with stories. So not only are our individual communities being impacted, but the culture of the Gulf Coast and as a whole is seen as a sacrifice area. This is not for me to say that both the West Coast and the East Coast have it any better, but simply to say, why is it that there are such high concentrations of fossil fuel activity located along our Texas and Louisiana Gulf Coast? Next slide. Because the infrastructure and the maps are there to give us a very clear picture. And that picture is that some areas matter and some don't. So that while there are federal decrees saying that there will no longer be offshore drilling in very specific species sensitive areas, the very heart, the hearth, the womb of our country, which is the Gulf Coast, is under attack. And so in this map, it clearly states, you can clearly see how many approved and not yet built LNG export terminals will be attacking our Gulf Coast waters. While again, I don't want to separate us, and this is not a oppression Olympics, but the rest of the waters aren't necessarily feeling this harm. And that's not even touching on the proposed LNG export terminals that are to come, by the way, 2 of which are along the Texas Gulf Coast in Galveston, 1 specifically, and then the rest are being situated in our sister state of Louisiana. And we have to ask ourselves why. Because prior to 2015, we had an oil export, a crude oil export ban. So fossil fuels were limited, seeing that 1, they cause detrimental harm in introducing greenhouse gases, and there wasn't a need. Next slide. So one of the many reasons is the massive fossil fuel expansion that is felt by the production of plastics facilities. Over 349 chemical industry projects are going to be launching. And I know several of us would say, if this was to heat our homes or power our cars, it would be a different story. But the plain and simple fact is that something as simple as a straw, a plastic bag, something that once you use it instantly becomes trash, lets us know that we are being treated as disposable and as dispensable as these items that are made for single use. So I really want to encourage folks, please visit fencelinewatch.org, visit our work, look at the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act of 2021, and definitely get engaged. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Kimber De Salvo.
Thank you, Yvette. Very powerful message. And thank you to all the panelists who spoke before. My name is Kimber, as I introduced myself earlier. And right now I'll be diving into the different projects of concern in the Houston-Galveston region and their environmental impacts. Next slide, please. In this area, there are 3 petrochemical terminals that are trying to go through the permitting process. Gulf Link near Jones Creek, which Yvette talked about, Seaport Oil Terminal or SPOT near Surfside, and Pilot LNG liquefied natural gas on Pelican Island. Next slide, please. Gulf Link will have a massive tank farm capable of storing 100,000 barrels of crude oil in the Jones Creek residential community, which is located in a flood zone that'll pump 2 million barrels of crude oil per day to an offshore loading platform for very large crude carrier ships. Gulf Link would emit 25% higher VOCs each day than all of the others emitted by the entire Houston-Galveston area combined. Next slide, please. Just 7 miles north, the Seaport Oil Terminal, or SPOT, includes an oil pipeline 168 miles long, stretching from Houston down to Surfside Beach, where it'll eventually travel 30 miles offshore to a terminal. This pipeline will cross 149 wetlands and 1 major river. It'll pass by the drinking water wells for the Surfside community. Next, please. Pilot LNG would be located on Pelican Island near Galveston. This floating bunker port that will fill up ships would store up to 16,000 cubic meters of gas and require a pipeline to be built to be constantly supplied with that gas. Next, please. These 3 facilities would harm the environment and be in direct opposition to the federal and state protections put in place in the region for the environment. Next, please. This region is home to the 5 species of endangered sea turtles that Joni mentioned earlier, 9 critically endangered Kemp's Ridley sea turtles, and 1 loggerhead sea turtles nested in this region's beaches last year. Because these turtles are endangered, each egg in each of their nests is crucial for the success and recovery of the species. Offshore, the region is federally protected as critical foraging habitat for loggerhead sea turtles. They forage on the floating sargassum or algal mats offshore. Other animals forage offshore here too, and use this region as a migratory swimway to traverse across the Gulf of Mexico. Increased ship traffics, oil spills, and decreased water quality would greatly impact these animals. This, next slide, please. This area is also home to the protected federal and state natural lands with the Brazoria and San Bernard National Wildlife Refuges and the Justin Hurst Wildlife Management Area. Each of these areas serve to protect the environment and provide safe wintering habitat for more than 320 species of migratory waterfowl and other birds, making it a bird watcher's paradise. It is because of this significance to waterfowl and migrating birds that both wildlife refuges were designated as an internationally significant shorebird site by the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. Next slide, please. Furthermore, both Surfside and Galveston were certified as bird cities in Texas to provide and to protect birds and their habitat. Next, please. In addition, the Upper Texas Coast Great Texas Coastal Birding Trail calls this region home with the popular San Bernard, Blue Water, and Galveston loops. This means that this area is a state-designated bird sanctuary. Next, please. Therefore, these pipelines and terminals want to build directly through federal and state protected natural habitat, a migratory swimway for endangered species, and through critical sea turtle nesting habitat. These protections were put in place for a reason, and the increased ship traffic and air and water pollution would disregard those reasons, not to mention what the impact of what a spill can do. Next slide, please. Spot and Gulf Link have the potential to cause a spill reminiscent of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill that Joni reminded us of, and emit 9,000 tons of volatile organic carbons and 396 million tons of additional carbon dioxide yearly. As shown in the map, a spill would affect over 146 miles of shoreline, posing threats to sea turtles, marine mammals, and birds. With these facilities being in such close proximity to each other, Spot and Gulf Link only 7 miles apart and Pilot LNG just 55 miles north, the cumulative impacts of each would be devastating on the air we breathe, the water we drink, the beaches we recreate on, and the environment that so many animals and endangered species call home. These facilities would destroy the coastal habitat and adversely impact important industries like fisheries, fishing, and tourism. The Gulf is already in crisis due to long-term pollution from existing industry and damages from increasing extreme weather events and storms. We need to prioritize defending the Gulf and stop viewing coastlines as a sacrifice zone for big oil. These projects are still in the permitting stage and in this region, and we encourage that you and your family and friends contact and write letters to federal agencies and your local representatives. Post public comments against the projects when comment periods are open, and express your concerns to Congress. We invite you to please join this public movement to stop these destructive projects. And with that, I'd like to kick it back over to Joni. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Melissa and Lav, Yvette, Kimber, Rebecca, so grateful for your participation this evening. Appreciate the Indigenous people of the Coastal Bend and Fenceline Watch for collaborating with us on this webinar. We hope, participants, that we have inspired you. We hope that you will join us to protect the cultural and historical significance of the land and water in our area, protect our communities, and protect our coastal resources for future generations, and protect them from future oil exploration and stand up against big oil. We must continue our work to ensure that future generations will inherit a healthy climate and planet. And you've heard a lot about participating. Make your voice be heard. Please join us. You'll receive an email with all our organizations and websites and be able to access. If you supply us with your email, you'll receive messages from us alerting you to public comment periods. So you can voice your opposition to these facilities. You can voice your opposition to the dredging and to the use of our water for these facilities. Also, we talked about plastics very briefly. This is an oil byproduct. Reduce your consumption of plastic products. Remember that our communities need each other. After the February freeze, there was great need up and down our community. Offer aid to the communities. And of course, they're nonprofits, so financial donations are always important to support our work. We greatly appreciate you being with us tonight. And we have a few minutes. I'm going to kick it back to Kimber so that we can take some questions.
Thanks, Joni. Yeah, we have a few questions. So what I'm going to do is go through some of them and pick up on our different panelists to answer them accordingly. We have a question from Marion Klein. Is the funding hopefully coming from the proposed infrastructure bill to address Corpus Christi's infrastructure issues? I believe maybe Love or Melissa, do you have insight into that?
I'm not sure on the infrastructure bill. I hope that they did pass a bill to fix our issues because there are a lot that have been neglected over the years. So, but I'm not too brushed up on that. I just saw all of the stuff on the EPA website about how they're suing our city for all the violations. So I hope that they are correcting the issues, but I don't know exactly on which bills are going to be addressing those.
If it's a bill, it's coming from the state level, or if Marion can elaborate on that a little bit.
Not sure if we're able to get.
Yeah, okay, no, that's fine, yeah.
But Marion did have another question that I'd like to cover a little bit. And please, panelists, jump in if you have something else to add. Marion said, in addition, how has the Biden administration supported certifying these 3 facilities, or have they not? So right now, our organizations are partnering with other organizations to defend the Gulf this week. And we put together a letter to the Biden administration asking them to not allow permitting for these. So stay tuned, reach out to your local representatives and ask them to help support our letter. So that was a good question. Let me see. We have another one from Brian Canny. Why doesn't the ESA apply to counter the industrial projects Kimber discussed? So it's hard to say why. I'm sure there's a lot of factors involved. When we're often writing comments to during the public comment periods, and the environmental impact reports say that they're mitigating their environmental impact. Sometimes they base these reports on old data. So it's really important that we have the most up-to-date science, the most up-to-date data, and that we get the most voices possible from you and your community members, your family and friends. The more comments going against it, they have to address our public comments. Each one has to be addressed. I hope that answers your question. Panelists, did you have anything else to add to that?
Kimber, if I may add, so our participants understand anytime there's a permit, they do look, usually Fish and Wildlife is consulted depending on the location, and they do allow take, even with an endangered species. For example, when there's work done on the beaches, dune restoration or beach cleaning work, they write in there, even though we mentioned the Kemp's Ridley and it's a critically endangered species, they still will allow take, including a nesting female and potentially a nest, depending on what the project is and when the project is going to take place. So the Endangered Species Act offers some protection, but these permits do address them, but they don't fully take into consideration, as Kimber was saying, we don't know the true population of a lot of our threatened and endangered animals. So it's kind of a backward process to allow a project to move forward knowing it's going to impact a habitat and also a species along with the communities in the area.
Thank you, Joni. We have another question from an anonymous attendee asking, how linked are you with the Sierra Club and other national organizations to protect the environment? Audubon, ? I think Joni would be a good one to answer that.
Sure, absolutely. And anybody else that I'm not sure who everybody partners with, but yes, we have Houston Audubon, National Audubon, Defenders of Wildlife, Center of Biological Diversity. Depending on the project, we work with organizations across the country. So I'm sure that our partners, Melissa and Love, do the same, as well as Yvette.
Yes, that's correct. We do work with Sierra Club affiliates, and we're part of a coalition. So there's different organizations that we work with. So yes, we are. Going back to Marion's comment, she put the bill is in the House at this point. So Marion, I hope I'm saying your name right. So when it comes to funding and all that, it depends whether the city is going to apply for it. So I guess from my understanding of the way funding comes, it goes from federal to state, and then at a local municipality level, then Corpus Christi could probably apply for funding. I haven't seen it on their agenda. As you said, it's barely passing the House, so we'll keep an eye out on that. So thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah, and what I would say to that question is, although a lot of people shed light on groups like the Audubon organization and the Sierra Club, I want to remind you that webinars like this are brought to you by local grassroots organizations that are locally based. And so when you support organizations like these and like others in your community, you're supporting whether it's your volunteer hours or your dollars are going directly to affecting the issues in our community. Because like so many people say, we have skin in the game. This is where we are located, our families, our roots, our cultural ties, everything from the traditions that we practice to the celebrations that we have at home and the food and culture we eat and consume. So when you do support organizations, support those that are locally based in the areas that are being affected, because, and I don't want to speak ill of any organization, but the dollars or the time and the effort that is being put and those organizations that have boots on the ground are these. At the end of the day, large national organizations represent the interests of larger federal policies that tend to move a little slower while we need to affect what's going on in our state now. So many of us have seen how Texas has been portrayed historically and even currently when all of those of us on the webinar know our reality. We know we are not against the environment. We're not against people. We're not against progression and having a just and equitable transition into a renewables market. So with that, I would say that, to the Biden question about LNG, I would say that the current administration has yet to have a solid stance on LNG, and it's expected that from 2020 to 2029, LNG exports would more than double. And the reason why that puts us even more in a crunch and crisis is that as we approach seasons like hurricane season that start June 1st, LNG, both export and extraction, adds to methane emissions that increase the climate crisis. So everything from the Texas freeze to the Hurricane Harveys of the world to the droughts we face in West Texas will increase. And so Not only is LNG currently being exported at a faster rate than demand even has, it is creating the climate catastrophe that we are living in our everyday lives.
Thank you, Yvette. We have a question from Robin Schneider asking us to lift up a hunger strike that's going on. So Diane Wilson is currently, I think she's on day 14 or 15 of a hunger strike to stop the dredging and fossil fuel exports going on in Lavaca Bay. And there's a proposed crude oil terminal, and essentially they're wanting to like dig and dredge up the bay to make room for these these large ships. And the problem is the sediment, as I think Yvette covered earlier, is mercury laden. And so it's a Superfund site. So dredging up these sediments could release this mercury back into the water and further impact our fish and water quality. So Robin wanted to bring that to light, and there's a solidarity fast happening tomorrow. I think Melissa added a link for that. And I also wanted to mention, we'll be following up with an email with the recording tomorrow with links and ways that you could help. And some of the projects I mentioned earlier, there's not current public comment periods open, but that doesn't mean that you can't reach out to your local representatives to tell them to say no to a lot of these projects. Let's see. Scanning through questions. Sorry. A lot of these have been covered. Yvette, this one might be for you. Have human health studies been done in the area to compile evidence?
Yes. In fact, back in 2015, and I'll use a very specific regional study and then a larger study over oil and gas refineries. In 2015, under Mayor Bill White's Environmental Task Force, they found staggering amounts of both benzene and 1,3-butadiene, two chemicals that are found to be both in the production process of plastics. And so what they found was that along stretches like the Houston Ship Channel, that's a heavily concentrated petrochemical area, 52-mile stretch. And I would argue it goes further and actually connects over to Corpus Christi and down through South Texas, is that 1,3-butadiene increased levels or increased rates of childhood leukemia. Not only did this bring more questions to what other cancers and pockets of cancer did this develop, but it also links plastics production over to 1,3-butadiene and childhood leukemia, and actually stated that if you live within a 10-mile radius of the Houston Ship Channel, then you are at a 56% higher chance of your family, or within your family, having childhood leukemia. So that was one. The other one was a UT study that was published in 2020 that linked refinery or extractive production, also linked to increased cancer pockets. You can also look at one more study, that's the East Harris County study, to look at the different types of cancer that are associated with petrochemical production. So it's not simply prostate cancer or breast cancer, but brain tumors, neurological issues, vision impairments, things that we would closely associate to old age or family history are more closely related to toxic exposures. And I can drop those links in the chat.
Thank you, Yvette. And we're going to close out with gratitude. So if you could go to the next slide. And I'll kick us back to Melissa to get us started.
Thank you, everybody, for this moving presentation and this webinar. Even though I know of a lot of what is going on, I don't think I'll ever know all of it. And so to hear from all of us today, and I'm just continuing to learn more about how we're more connected and more we're going through similar fights, even though we're in different geographical areas. Again, we're all near and up against the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. So we share this water body, and we share the responsibility to speak up for in defense of it. And so I would just like to thank you all who are on as participants, as well as the panelists for working so hard to prepare for this webinar. Thank you to the Turtle Island Restoration Network for all that you do and for inviting us to share this space. Thank you to Yvette from Fenceline Watch, who continues the extremely hard work. But I feel like with all of this, you know, nothing comes easy. Anything that's worth something is never easy. And so I feel like even though this work, you know, it's just the beginning for some of us, may last lifetimes, but it's worth it if we can work and building a better future for all of the future generations, whether that be a people of the plant and animal relations or just the elements that have been spoken about today. So I would like to open it up to the rest of the panelists to give gratitude and help to close out this webinar. So I will pass it to Love.
Naya Waka, I love you and thank you. This was a good webinar. We all had good information, and I see the passion in everything that we're doing and sharing. I thank all the attendees for coming and hearing what we are going through, what we are working on, and really looking forward to the support that we're going to be getting. Thank you, Joni. Thank you, Kimber. Thank you, Rebecca from Turtle Island Restoration, for joining forces with Yvette, Melissa, and I. And this is a very good collaboration. I'm looking forward to more collabs like this. So again, thank you to everybody. I'm very grateful.
How about Rebecca?
Oh, sorry, Yvette. I'm so sorry. I was like, bye. I'm so sorry about that.
So much appreciation to being on this wonderful panel with Love, Rebecca, Joni, everyone who's asking questions, being engaged, staying with us until 8:02 in the evening on such a commemorative day for so many reasons. So I hope you leave this presentation with information, a way to feel empowered, a way to feel engaged, and looking for a positive future so that we can continue having conversations that include the species we affect, the land, the water, and also the vulnerable populations that should be engaged. And I'll pass it over to Rebecca. Rebecca, you haven't had an opportunity.
Thank you, Yvette. And thank you so much for joining us tonight, as Yvette said, late on this evening. You know, it's really important for everyone at Turtle Island Restoration Network to sort of merge, you know, the environment and ocean issues with the communities that you know, marine animals share. And I just wanted to reiterate that when this webinar ends, it does not mean that this relationship ends, and we are very looking forward to continuing to share our actions that can, you know, make our communities a better place that ultimately will, you know, help the whole world. So just, you know, please stay tuned and, you know, stay on the lookout for any emails from us with actions and ways that you can get involved. And I'm not sure if Joni perhaps has some words.
Thank you. Thank you, ladies. It's just so moving, and I'm so grateful to be involved with each of you. You're so powerful and passionate, and I appreciate all the efforts that you do. And I appreciate the participants. I know it's getting late. We're running a few minutes late. I think all the sentiments have been expressed. And so I'm so grateful that we've met and that we will continue to work together to save our communities. And I'm going to send it to Kimber to close us out for the evening.
Hey. So I'm equally thankful. I think everybody else did a really great job of expressing gratitude. So I'll piggyback off of them and say that I'm thankful for all of you who've attended today and all these really powerful voices coming together, bringing all these different perspectives. It's really cool to see this idea that I cooked up with love over the phone one day come to light. So with that, I'm really excited for the future movement that we keep building. And yeah, I'll close it off here. Thank you so much, everybody. We'll be sending out a follow-up email probably tomorrow with links and the recording. Thanks, everyone.